Hello everyone, welcome back to another remote sensing lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to begin tackling this first piece of our module by talking about what do we mean when we talk about change. Or put another way, you might call it categories of change, or you might call it characterizations of change. So let's give ourselves a little bit of room here, and let's make a new heading, and we'll call this heading categories of change. Right, and again, this gets back at the idea of what type of change are we trying to identify, or what level of detail in terms of information about the change are we trying to identify. Okay, and there are four categories. The first category, this is the most basic level, and we call this change, no change. Right, and so you can imagine a scenario where we have two different classification outputs, one at time 1 and one at time 2, right? Doing a change, no change category of change detection would basically just say, did the class change from one time to the next, yes or no? We have no idea about what type of change occurred. We just know that it's different now than it was then. So this is basically saying change happened. Or it didn't. Right. This is probably one of the more common types of change detection. It's also the easiest type of change detection because all we need to know is what was it doing before and what is it doing now. And if those two things are different, then we have change. Right? We're not worried about anything else. Hopefully that makes sense. And again, we're going to talk about this in a little more detail in a little bit. The second type of change detection, or the second category of change, is what's called a before-after. Right, it's called a before-after change. So with before-after changes, this is basically the next step from change, no change. Right? Because with before-after change, not only are we saying, did change happen or didn't it, but if it happened, right, what did it change from and what did it change to? So you can think of this, again, using the example of land cover or a supervised classification, right? If at time 1 you had an area that was forested, right, so it's coming up as a forest class. And then 5 years later, you have another image, you run the classification, and in that time period, right, the trees were cut down and the farmer planted wheat, for example. So in time 2, right, that pixel would now come up as, say, pasture or crop, right? So not only can we say that yes, change happened, right? It's changed its classification from forest to crop, but we can also say something about what it changed from, right? It changed from forest, right? Forest before, to crop, right? Crop after. So that's before, after change, right? You give an indication of what it was before and what it changed to after. So again, right, before, after, as the name implies, right? That we start off with one class, we know what that class is, then we transition to a different class, and we know what that class is. So not only can we say that change happened, we can also say sort of what it changed from and what it changed to. Hopefully that makes sense. The third type of change detection, so we're sort of getting more complicated here. The third type of change detection is magnitude of change. Right, so magnitude of change, right, we're still saying change happened or it didn't. Now, we might be saying what it was and what it is, but we're saying something potentially even more than that. We're talking about how much change has occurred. We'll talk about the methods in the next video, but one method is what's called image differencing, where you actually take the pixel values in one image and subtract them from the pixel values in another. And so you can imagine in that case, you might have a wide range of values where the extremes on either side represent massive amounts of change, right? Something drastic happened, right? You can imagine if you took NDVI, for example, and you subtracted the NDVI of one image from the NDVI of another, right? You can imagine that having values, extreme values, would represent drastic changes from either no vegetation to lots of vegetation, or from lots of vegetation to no vegetation, right? That would be extreme changes. So you can say, you can sort of give an indication of not just that something happened, not just, oh, well, it changed from this to this, but sort of the degree or the magnitude of the change, right? How badly or how much did it change? And again, when we talk about image differencing in the next video, or the next couple of videos, you'll really get a better sense of this magnitude of change. Because it really does sort of, you have to think a little bit about what is being done. So just a little bit. And then the final, right, the final type of change that we want to characterize is the cause, right, the cause of change. Now this one is either really straightforward or really difficult. And it really depends on what type of change we're measuring or what type of change we're looking for. And it also depends on how familiar you are with the study region. So you could imagine, right, a cause of change could be something like a flood or a fire or conversion of land cover for human use, right? These are all really big, noticeable changes, right? You can clearly tell, oh yeah, we had forest here, now we have a crop, right? We can do before and after. And we can say with some level of certainty that the cause of that change was a person, right? Or a company coming in, cutting down those trees and replacing them with wheat or whatever crop they're growing. But that's really easy to measure cause of change. But think about something a little more nuanced. Let's say that we're trying to measure an invasive species, right? And you can imagine that an invasive species, depending on the particulars of that species, right, it may be hard to distinguish, right? If we have an invasive species of tree that has green leaves, and we're trying to map and monitor that species progression through a forest of native species that also have green leaves, right, that might be very hard to characterize. Hopefully that makes sense. I know this one's a little bit tricky, but we're trying to use remote sensing not just to monitor how things changed, but to tie that back to the cause of the change. Right, this relates change back to its causes. Right, so this would be, for example, you could have something like fire, right, flood, deforestation, right? These are easy. Or you could have something that might be harder to measure, like an invasive species. Right, this could be hard. So hopefully that makes sense. So just to sort of recap, right? Right. So with remote sensing, we're trying to determine different types of change. We have different sort of goals at the end. The easiest of which is going to be to simply determine whether or not we have some change. We don't care how much, we don't care what it was and what it went to. We just want to say, hey, change occurred here. Right? That's the change, no change. Moving up a step in complexity would be to look and say, okay, well, we have some change. What was it before and what was it after, right? We're giving an indication of what it changed from and what it changed to, which can be extremely important. Upping the difficulty a little more, we have this idea of magnitude of change, right? And with magnitude of change, we're trying to give an indication of not just what changed, but how much, right? How severe was that change? And then finally, sort of the hardest to do is this idea of cause of change, where we're relating back what we see in the imagery to the things we know about in the real world that are occurring to figure out, okay, we have all of this change, but what's the driver, right? Is it a natural disaster? Is it a human effect? Is it something like an invasive species, right? And again, you can imagine on the spectrum of causes, right? This could be something very easy to determine, or it could be something very hard. And depending on the level of difficulty, right, determines whether or not cause can actually even be identified by remote sensing, right? Again, an invasive species, right? This could be very difficult to determine with remote sensing, depending on the invasive species and what it manifests to in terms of how it affects the spectral response curves. So hopefully this makes sense. And if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.